Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today for this webinar where we're really digging into the role of school counselors and post-secondary success. This webinar is being brought to you today from the College and Career Readiness and Success Center. And our goal as a federally funded center is to support state education agencies and local education agencies build their capacity to implement policies that are related to college and career readiness. And we do that through providing a variety of different technical assistance opportunities. Our website is listed here on the slide. If you have any more questions about our website or want to ask specific questions, we've got our email address up here as well. We're not going to take much of our time today to go over that, but it's a resource for you later on if you're interested. Today, during our session, we have a lot of great content that we want to get through today. And so our primary way for you to engage with us during the webinar will be by submitting questions. On the left side of your screen, or the right side of your screen, you'll be able to see a question box. It might be on the left, it might be on the right, but there's a box that says questions, and you can use that to submit questions. We have designated time throughout the session today to do questions and answers. So please go ahead and at any point in time, you can submit questions there. You can also raise your hand if you have a question and we'll unmute that. At the end of the session today, important, we're going to be sending out a survey that is a short feedback survey for us. We really hope everyone will take that. And then we are also recording our webinar today, and that's the link for that. We'll also send that out to everybody once the link and the recording has been posted. And with that, I am going to hand this over to our moderator today, my colleague Helen Duffy.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm really honored to have this really great panel of presenters gathered here today to share what we've learned that you can find in a brief that was published on the College and Career Readiness and Success Center called Building a System for Post-Secondary Success, the Pivotal Role of School Counselors. I'll be your moderator today, and we are joined by Dr. Molly Streer, who is an assistant professor at San Francisco State University in the School Counseling and Pupil Services area. And Dr. Streer has been sharing her expertise with us. She's a school counselor educator. We also have two folks from Colorado today with us. Courtney Cabrera is a manager in the Educator Effectiveness Office at the Colorado Department of Education and supports districts as they implement an evaluation system that meets Colorado requirements. Eva Pugh is a professional licensed school counselor, and she also works for the Colorado Department of Education as the school counselor coordinator. We're also joined by Cynthia Floyd, who's been working in education and student support services for over 26 years. And is currently serving as the state consultant for school counseling at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And finally, we have with us Dr. Loretta Whitson, who is currently the executive director of the California Association of School Counselors, which is actually the largest state association representing school counselors in the nation. So I'm really looking forward to this esteemed panel. Before we get started, however, what we'd like to do is conduct a poll and find out who you are, what your role is. And so perhaps you can open that poll for us and we'll see who's joined us today. So it looks like a little less than half of you are school counselors yourselves. About 9% district level administrators, some SEA staff, and about a third are other. I know it's difficult to describe what other means, but maybe we'll hear from you in the chat box or in the questions. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just set the context here for a moment and talk a little bit about why we did this in the first place. So first, we're going to talk about school counselors and the role that they can play in supporting post-secondary and career readiness initiatives. We think that the role of school counselors is underappreciated when it comes to leadership in this area. And in order to think about this, what we did is we are going to summarize school counselor evaluation requirements across the nation, and then provide some examples of state-level school counselor evaluation practices and policies. And then Dr. Whitson is going to share with us some recommendations for state and local education agencies to develop policies. So why did we do this? If you look at state ESSA plans, there are growing calls for personalized learning. So we know actually that 39 states mention personalized learning in their ESSA plans, with 17 of those states naming it as a key component of their vision for excellence. We also know that there are expanding practices that build student awareness of and preparation for a wide range of post-secondary options. And unfortunately, we know from recent events across the country that there's increasing attention for the need to focus on social emotional learning. And school counselors are really uniquely positioned to provide leadership and services across all three of these areas. But that's only if the expectations for their day-to-day activities reflect that expertise. And we believe that evaluation policies and practices help shape and define those professional expectations, and they help guide professional growth. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Molly Streer, and she's going to share our methods and the findings from our scan. Molly?
Thank you, Helen. As Helen mentioned, I'm Molly Streer, and I'm an assistant professor of school counseling at San Francisco State University. As a former school counselor, it's my pleasure to briefly introduce some of the roles and responsibilities of school counselors and the foundation of our work examining school counseling evaluation practices across the nation. I'm super excited to see that 43% of the attendees are practicing school counselors at the time that we conducted our poll. So for those of you that are school counselors, please bear with me while I just do a brief introduction of what it is that a school counselor actually is, for those of you on the line who may not be as familiar with that role. So although there is some variation, school counselors are certified or licensed student service providers with extensive education in fostering students' holistic development, which includes academic, post-secondary, career, and social and emotional goals. Further, school counselors are positioned to support more inclusive, supportive, and safe school climate. With extensive knowledge of leadership, advocacy, collaboration, and systemic change, school counselors are key stakeholders in students' educational journeys, supporting students to reach their full potential. School counselors that operate within a comprehensive school counseling model provide individual, small group, and school-wide services that support student success in diverse school communities through a multi-tiered system of support. Pardon me, I've gone a bit far. There we go. Career and college readiness and success are integral aspects of school counselors' roles and responsibilities, and there is an increased body of research demonstrating that access to school counselors leads to improved post-secondary and career readiness outcomes for students. For example, students who engage in individual student planning with school counselors are more likely to plan for college and have higher rates of free application for federal student aid completion, which we know are critical gateways to post-secondary access, especially for disadvantaged populations of students. However, despite the value of school counselors, our roles and responsibilities are often misunderstood and frequently underutilized. According to the American School Counselor Association, which is often referred to as ASCA, and we may be referring to as ASCA throughout this presentation, it's also, for those of you who aren't aware, the flagship professional organization in school counseling. According to ASCA, schools should have one school counselor for every 250 students at a minimum. Unfortunately, a state scan that they conducted indicated that in the 2015-2016 academic year, only 3 states in our nation had a state-level average that met the recommended ratio of one school counselor to 250 students. Perhaps even more concerning is the recent report conducted by the American Civil Liberties Union indicating that students of color, students with disabilities, and students in impoverished communities are frequently in schools with police officers, but no school counselors. With the knowledge that school counselors are often misunderstood and underutilized, our team sought to better understand school counselor evaluation practices and how effective evaluation can be used as a policy lever at district and state levels. Despite the school counseling field's assertion that clear evaluation practices are important for school counselors' professional identity and accountability practices, it quickly became clear that school counselors have a history of either not being systematically evaluated or being evaluated using tools that were developed for other educational stakeholders, such as teacher evaluation tools. I myself, having been a school counselor, have experienced that as well. We believe that increased understanding of the roles and responsibilities of school counselors and the potential of effective school counseling services is essential for ensuring all students have equal access to school counselors and comprehensive school counseling programs. Furthermore, school counselors are well positioned to support the implementation of personalized learning plans that lead to improved post-secondary access and attainments. Based on our belief that specialized annual evaluations for school counselors could lead to more effective school counseling practices and improved student outcomes, we conducted a scan of publicly available resources and information on state education agency websites and state-level School Counselor Association websites to explore school counselor evaluation practices in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. As you can see on this slide here, we do describe our method in more detail in our brief that is currently posted on the College and Career Readiness and Success Center, and which there is a link for you to access in the chat box, I believe. So as you can see, some of our methodology is here on the slide regarding how we approach that search systematically to try to find out as much as we could about school counselor evaluation practices across the nation. So as you can see here from our map and our infographic regarding our findings, as you will see across the country, we did find a patchwork of practices related to evaluation of the professional contributions of school counselors. Based on our scan, we found that only 7 states require school counselors to be evaluated on performance using its state education agency developed or recognized process or tool for school counselor specific evaluation. And that piece is really key here, that we are talking about evaluation practices that are very specific to school counseling and their roles and responsibilities. We found that an additional 29 states do provide school counselor specific evaluation guidance and/or tools. However, local education agencies are not required to follow state guidance. 4 states provide evaluation guidance and/or tools that are not specific to school counselors, such as teacher or specialized school personnel evaluation guidance and/or resources. We found that 5 states provide no state-specific tools or guidance, but did provide links to ASCA resources. And an additional 6 states had no publicly available information on school counselor evaluations using the search guidelines. It is important to note that just because we did not identify those tools, resources, or practices, that does not mean that they don't exist. It just means that they weren't publicly available and we were not able to identify those resources. One of the things that I think is really great about this brief is that if you are interested in learning more about these policies, practices, and resources for your own schools, districts, or states, we've compiled a fairly inclusive, to the best of our ability, table in our brief. So for more thorough information regarding our state scan, including all of the materials that we compiled from each state and links to those resources, please see our recently published brief on the College and Career Readiness and Success Center website. Okay, so within our state scan, one of our objectives was to identify states that had exemplar school counselor evaluation practices and to learn from those states what it is that they did to leverage evaluation practices and school counseling across the state. So based on the information gleaned from our state level review, Colorado, North Carolina, and Indiana emerged due to the comprehensive nature of their state level guidance and professional coherence for school counselors. Although only North Carolina requires the use of its state developed tools in its public schools, all 3 states had robust evaluation systems designated specifically for school counselors, indicating shared expectations regarding roles and responsibilities. Whereas other states had similar systems in place, these 3 states had clearly defined expectations for school counseling that were grounded in the conceptual framework of the American School Counselor Association, and each state leveraged additional initiatives such as individual academic student plans, legislation, and/or funding involving school counselors. You're going to hear in detail from representatives from both Colorado and North Carolina here today. However, just as a brief example of some of the things that we identified as exemplar and our reason for highlighting these states in our brief will be presented in the next couple of slides. So for example, in Colorado, an examination of school counseling revealed several policies and programs emphasizing the role of school counselors as skilled service providers who support students' academic, social, emotional, post-secondary, and workforce readiness development, despite the fact that school counselors are not required in the state schools. Notably, Colorado's Educator Effectiveness State Model Evaluation System, School Counselor Corps Grant Program, and individual career and academic plans position school counselors as integral stakeholders on the Colorado education landscape. North Carolina was identified for informally contributing to the development of Colorado's school counselor evaluation rubric, as well as legislation specifying appropriate school counselor duties, which we believe is a really important key. After reviewing school counseling policies and practices in North Carolina, it was clear that despite the fact that school counselors are not mandated in every school, and North Carolina is a local control state, clear expectations for the roles and responsibilities of school counselors emerged as key components of their comprehensive evaluation guidance. That guidance includes a state-level job description, professional school counseling standards, and a rubric developed specifically for school counselors. North Carolina also provides self-paced training modules for school counselors and school administrators for effective integration of evaluation materials and has state-level guidance for school counselors through a state school counselor leadership team focused on school counselor and administrator skills in supporting students' career and college readiness. Although we won't be hearing from Indiana today, Indiana is highlighted in our brief due to their mandated annual evaluation of school counselors using a state-approved process and tool. This tool was developed by a counselor evaluation leadership team to intentionally promote partnerships between school counselors and administrators. Indiana was also included because the state received a substantive endowment to support a comprehensive school counseling initiative, as well as their recent recognition for a record number of ASCA model programs through the recognized ASCA model program, or RAMP, designation in the 2017-2018 academic year. Indiana also had noteworthy state-level research on school counseling practices and outcomes conducted by the Indiana Chamber of Commerce Foundation, highlighting school counseling as a priority in the states. And with that, we will transition back to Helen to briefly address any questions you may have about this portion of the webinar.
Thanks, Molly. So we'll pause here. Those of you who are attending, please be sure to enter any questions you might have in the questions box. But one of the things I wanted to ask, Molly, I know that there were other states that kind of rose to the top as we were doing the scan. Can you talk about across these 3 states, like, what do you think the key lessons are that we can take away? What is it that they have in common, do you think?
Absolutely. So I think for myself, one of the things that I took away, and one of the reasons that we highlighted these 3 states, is that it was very, very clear that there was state-level guidance and coherence regarding the definition of school counselors and the emphasis on effective school counseling programs using data-driven decision-making, ensuring that we're measuring student outcomes and looking at how students are different as a result of school counseling programs. All of the language that's been provided by the American School Counselor Association, other advocates and leaders in the field regarding what we believe best practice is in the school counseling field and what we want our roles and responsibilities to be. That was really coherent at the state level, and that state level guidance through evaluation practices and policies, but also lots of other opportunity to really position school counselors as leaders in those states. So I really think that clear role definition was one of the key components, and that state level and local education agencies working together is very important and something that was very salient with across these 3 states that we highlighted.
Thanks. Okay, and another question that I think is a good one, particularly given your role as a professor at San Francisco State. One of our attendees wanted to know how counselor education is involved in these efforts across the nation.
That's an excellent question. So counselor educators can be key stakeholders in ensuring that we have this collaboration among different various levels of stakeholders. So I think for myself as a counselor educator, fundamentally, it's really important that we are aware of current best practice in the field. I think it's really important that we're looking at what the research says for promising and evidence-based practices, combining that, bringing that into our classrooms, and ensuring that our students are learning to be culturally responsive, effective school counselors that are using data to drive their practices, and showing folks how powerful they can be in the school to promote systemic change ultimately. So I think as a counselor educator, that is the first and foremost. We have to have transformative classrooms where students come out equipped to do the work that they're intended to do. With that said, I think counselor educators are a pivotal piece in the collaboration between practicing school counselors, local education agencies, state education agencies, and really advocating for policies and practices across the state that are congruent with those best practices that we're teaching in the classroom.
Thanks. And another sort of thought that came to mind with that question is sort of a tension between preparing school counselors for the schools you sort of hope that they end up in, and preparing school counselors for the realities that they're going to face in some of the classrooms. So do you feel that tension as a school counselor preparation professor?
There's no question. Full transparency, that's actually part of why I decided to go back and become a counselor educator was because I believed after receiving my master's degree in both clinical mental health counseling and school counseling, that I went out into the schools and I felt like there were still pieces missing in order to really prepare me to be the best school counselor that I could be. And so part of my desire to go back and be a counselor educator was to help to move our field forward so that the students that are coming into our training programs and going out to become practicing school counselors are really aligned with what best practice is. And I also think that it's so very important, and part of why this brief is important to me is that the clear communication and consensus of what we believe school counselors can be as leaders and advocates and really agents of change in our schools needs to be something that we are promoting and advocating for, even in schools and districts where perhaps that hasn't been historically the case. So I do think it's really, really important that we continuously are aware of that tension and moving this work forward.
Yeah, and I think also that relates in part to another question about how school counselors can fulfill these roles that we know they can fulfill with such large caseloads.
Absolutely. So I think it's important to note that advocating for appropriate caseloads, best practice caseloads, as I talked about earlier in our introduction, the American School Counselor Association does recommend a ratio of 1 to 250. As I mentioned, that's just not the case across the nation. So I think we need to always continually advocate for that ratio. With that said, school counselors are trained and well equipped to work within a multi-tiered system of support and provide resources to meet the needs of all students in diverse communities. So through a multi-tiered system of support, school counselors are well equipped to really meet the needs of a lot of students. With that being said, we need to ensure that school counselors are able to really do what they're trained to be doing. So again, having their roles and responsibilities congruent with what their training is and what our field believes is best practice at that time is essential for meeting all of those student needs. It's really hard if school counselors aren't being utilized in the way that they are trained. It's hard to meet those needs if you're not actually capable of doing those things.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's transition at this stage, and we'll hear from Courtney and Eva from Colorado and learn more about their practices.
Great, thank you so much, Helen. So this is Courtney Cabrera, and full disclosure, I am not a school counselor, nor do I have that experience. But I have been in the Educator Effectiveness Office here at Colorado, and I actually worked at the Educator Effectiveness Office of the Indiana Department of Education. So that's sort of my frame, and that's also where I'll stay in my lane there, if you will, and just sort of sharing some of the legislative requirements for Colorado's law and talking a little bit about our state model evaluation system here in Colorado. And I'll really let Eve be the expert that she is in answering any counselor-specific questions, as she is truly the expert. So with that, I just want to give you a high-level overview about sort of some of our requirements for our evaluation legislation here in Colorado. So these are sort of the big values, if you will, for our legislation. So first and foremost, really developing a system to evaluate the effectiveness of licensed personnel. And that was really important when we think about that verbiage, licensed personnel. And really thinking about improving the quality of outcomes for students through the support of continual improvement of practice. And so here in Colorado, one of our first tasks when our legislation was passed was sort of defining who are these licensed personnel folks. So we knew teacher, we knew principal, but we also have 9 groups of special services providers, and that's what we call them here in Colorado, and the school counselor being one of those special services providers. So along with that, really thinking about that systemic approach, the value really when we thought about the legislation here in Colorado was also about a mechanism for providing meaningful feedback for professional growth and continuous improvement. really moving away from this idea of a punitive system to one that really is honoring the importance of the role of the school counselor, and how do we build a tool that will provide that roadmap not only for the school counselor, but also helping the evaluator understand the role and responsibility of the school counselor. And then finally, how do we use evaluation data to make good decisions for kids? And so, you know, we can think about it in a variety of different ways, and there's a number of things listed here, whether it's hiring, promotion, assignment, professional development support. So how do we use evaluation information, whether it's data that's coming out of the system, whether it's information that we're collecting anecdotally through the evaluation system? How do we use that in a more meaningful way to make better decisions for kids, if you will? And so our next slide really talks about, like, what are the nitty-gritty requirements for school counselors here in Colorado. So we do have statewide minimum standards for what it means to be an effective special services provider. So we have here in Colorado sort of a set of standards that apply to all special services providers. So as I mentioned, we have 9 different groups, the school counselor being one of them. And so these standards are written at a very high level to talk about whether it's professional expertise, professional behavior, or sort of the service delivery mechanisms here. So those standards are written at a pretty high level. And then we also have what we call elements here in Colorado, and those further define the standards. So every school counselor here in Colorado, whether they use our state model evaluation system or not, have to have a system aligned to those standards and elements. We also have a requirement for annual evaluations for all of our SSPs. And then part of our legislation here in Colorado is that 50% of an SSP's evaluation has to be related to the outcomes of the students they support. And so we have some really interesting requirements that are different than teachers, and I've shared them here with you on our slide. But essentially, of that 50%, districts here in Colorado, being a local control state, have a ton of flexibility in determining what that looks like. But the state board rule does say that they have to have at least 2 measures, and those measures should be aligned with the role and duty of the individual SSP being evaluated. And then the other component related to that 50% is that if you have a school counselor, for example, who is shared amongst a number of buildings, the data used in their evaluation can be sort of shared amongst either the sites that they're in or a representative sample of the sites. So in some of our very rural districts, we have 1 school counselor for the entire district. So we're not having an expectation that every point of data from every student that they support is a factor in their evaluation. But ultimately, districts have a ton of flexibility when it comes to making those determinations. So those are sort of the big nitty-gritty requirements for our legislation here in Colorado. And so now I just want to show you sort of what our evaluation system looks like at a glance, whether you're using the state model evaluation system or not. So over here, you can kind of see our quality standards. We have 4 of them. I mentioned professional expertise, our learning environment, high quality service delivery, and professionalism. So those 4 quality standards combine to equal 50% of a school counselor's evaluation here in Colorado. And then that other 50% is related to measures of student outcomes, which is what I had just shared with you about 2 measures of student outcomes that are aligned to the role and duty of the SSP. And that data could be coming from a representative sample of the sites in which the SSP works. And so when you combine those two 50%, so our professional practice standards and our measures of student learning, our SSPs come out with 1 of 4 ratings, and those do come from our statute here in Colorado. So when we think about our state model evaluation system, that's really about these 4 quality standards here. So if a district here in Colorado decides not to use our state model evaluation system, they still need to have an evaluation system aligned to those standards, and then our unpacked elements, which are 1 level further defined. So just sort of giving you a high-level overview of what our system here in Colorado looks like. And then we also wanted to highlight that we've just gone through a significant revision in our state model evaluation systems for all of our SSP groups, including our school counselor. And so here in Colorado, because we sort of have a one set of standards and elements for all 9 groups, we sort of had 2 groups working on the revision. So our first group is our steering committee, and the steering committee was really a group of folks representing each of those 9 groups, and they worked together to create this common set of standards and elements. And then we had a work group that was made up specifically of school counselors. Eve was a part of that, along with a number of other folks. And they were the ones who really did the nitty-gritty expectation building for what we call professional practices. And so our professional practices are sort of our final level of expectation. So we have those standards that are very high level, so service delivery, then we have elements that further define that service delivery, and then we unpack it one level further in the state model, and those are what we call professional practices. And so those were really created by our experts, including Eve, and then all of that was sort of wrapped up into our state model evaluation system for school counselors. And then we received our State Board of Education approval on the standards and elements for all 9 SSPs. And this school year in 1920, we're looking at full implementation of those state model revised standards and elements and professional practices. And so just as a breakdown of what we've done, sort of the main goal in thinking about this revision was to really streamline our rubrics. We noticed across all 9 groups that we had a number of redundancies across elements or even across standards. And so we really wanted to focus on high leverage practices that we could really focus on that idea of quantitative or qualitative data informing what practices we viewed as high leverage. And we also really wanted our work groups to clarify language and trying to focus on measurability of our professional practices where possible. We often hear that even with a content-specific rubric with our state model, that a lot of times our school counselors are being evaluated by somebody who is not a school counselor themselves. So how can we really leverage this revision process to clarify that language and also increase our measurability in our professional practices? And so when we thought about that, all of that combined, this is sort of where we landed. So on our previous special services provider rubrics, we had 5 standards, and our revised, excuse me, we're down to 4. We used to have 25 elements, and now we're down to 17. And our number of professional practices varied from each rubric. And so you can kind of see the range there in what was revised. And so as I mentioned, this revision was really about clarifying language, streamlining where we could, and also aligning to our teacher expectations because both our teacher and SSP systems are very closely aligned. And so Eve can really talk about sort of what that process looked like because she was a participant in one of our expert groups. But when we think about this revision process, really honoring that idea of continuous improvement, not only of our professionals, but of our evaluation systems. And so we really wanted to honor that it was time to look at our evaluation system for school counselors and revise. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Eve, and she can talk about both the revision and a bunch of other amazing things that she's a part of.
Thanks, Courtney. My name is Eve Pugh, and I am the School Counselor Coordinator here at the Colorado Department of Education, and it's certainly a pleasure to be with you today to talk about school counseling in Colorado, not only the evaluation piece, but what we do in Colorado to support school counselors. So yes, I was a part of the group that worked on the evaluation for the school counselor group, and it was truly an amazing process. And I feel like we've really had the right people at the table. Courtney mentioned that many times we are not evaluated, or most times we're not evaluated by a licensed school counselor, but an administrator. And I, like Molly, when she mentioned that she was evaluated using a teacher or an admin evaluation tool, as was I. So we had the right people at the table with the work groups. We had administrators, we had every level of school counselor, we had school counselor evaluators, we had school counselor professors from across the state. So it really was a great group, and we came out with a great process. I've been able to share it across the state at some of the trainings, and counselors are really excited about the process and the evaluation tool that will be implemented this year. Again, we're a local control state, so the School districts don't have to use it. However, they have to use those elements that Courtney mentioned. So thank you for going through that with us, Courtney, and the process. So some of the ways that Colorado supports school counselors is through the School Counselor Corps Grant Program. And so this purpose of this program is to increase the graduation rate, decrease dropout rate, and basically is to increase the availability of effective school-based counseling within schools. It's grant funding, and it is competitive, but they're used to increase, and that word increase is important, the level of school counseling services provided to improve that graduation rate. So I went through some of the frequently asked questions. Many states will ask about the program, and it is a competitive grant that is 4 years. And what's unique about this is many grants you'll hear are 3 years. Well, we do have a 4th year, but the year 1 is a development year, and it's designed not to just hire counselors and go forth and counsel, but to actually do a deep dive in data collection to determine the actual needs of the district and develop a plan to systemically change the district and make the student success level increase. And then in years 2, 3, and 4, they're for implementation. During year 1, the SMART goals and action plans were established, and then they have 3 years to actually implement those. So how do we know that it's working? Well, data collection is so important in anything we do as school counselors, and it's really around the ASCA model that they're implementing. So annual reporting is required as part of the conditions of the grant. So I just mentioned the goals of the grant. So this slide will be real easy to go through about just implementing that ASCA model, increasing that school counseling. And of the grantees that we have, there are currently 65 districts of 175 in Colorado that are funded right now, and 155 schools. Of those schools that are funded, our research shows that the student to counselor ratio is about 1 to 233. So that is below the ASCA recommendation. However, statewide, we're not at the 250 yet, but we're inching that way. So we're happy about that. So what's happened with the School Counselor Corps program outcomes? We've been around for about 10 years, and it is a $10 million state-funded grant. So remember, it is state-funded, and part of the condition of the grant or an expectation is that these programs and positions are going to be sustained beyond grant funding. But over the 10 years, I should say 9, I don't have the latest data or statistics, but more than 300 licensed school counselors have been served. Part of what we do is you can't just hire anybody. Statute actually says that you must be a licensed school counselor to be funded through the grant. So that's very important that we know that the right people are in the right positions. So more than 300 have been served and hired with grant funds. And you can see the next bullet, since class of 2015, that our FAFSA completions have increased, although we know it's not where we want it to be, but it's still higher than the state average, and we're working on that as well. And that I mentioned that we are at 233 in the schools that we've been in. Moving to the next slide. Courtney mentioned, as well as Molly mentioned, about the ICAP process, the individual career and academic plan. And we have a great person in our office that works with the Colorado community college system and travel all over the state working with ICAP. They've also put together a team of ICAP facilitators that regionally work with their districts to increase and make this process really a process. It is truly unique. It pulls out unique talents of the students and their aspirations, their career and post-secondary options, because we know there are many, and the pathways and finances to get there. So on this slide, there's actually, we put a link to the Department of Education's ICAP page. So we have quality indicators for our ICAP elements, and they are here listed. They're self-awareness, the career awareness, post-secondary and workforce aspirations and options, environmental expectations, which is important, and your academic planning. And that's all infused with the essential skills and financial literacy. And finally, I'm going to turn it over now to Cynthia, I believe, with North Carolina.
Thank you. And I enjoy hearing from other states too. Again, this is Cynthia Floyd. I'm the consultant for school counseling at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And as mentioned earlier, I've been in education for 26 years, or a little over 26 years, starting out as a school counselor and otherwise working in roles either supporting or supervising school counseling. So it's been a lifetime dedication of something I really enjoy. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how we got where we are in North Carolina, more so than actually showing you what our evaluation rubric does or something like that. My last slide for North Carolina does have the website where you can find all of our evaluation information. But I wanted to share with you how we got there, because that is the toughest thing to do. And do keep in mind that this took a long time, as you can see from the dates on your screen. Systemic change does not happen quickly. This isn't something you can do like, we're going to start this in August and by July we're going to have it. Systemic change takes a long time and a lot of perseverant collaboration. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about how we got to where we are. And we still have further to go, but we've come a long way. So the revision to our state job description and our professional standards and eventually our evaluation was key for us really clarifying the appropriate school counselor roles, showing how school counselor services can align with school and district missions, aligning our job description and evaluation instrument with national best practices, and really giving a standard framework from which to plan and individualize services to address student and school needs effectively. So although, as you can see on here, 2006, it's been quite a while since we came up with that job description, and then in 2008, reformatted it into a professional standards template that the rest of our personnel services evaluation rubrics were going into. It's still relevant because, like the Ask a National model, it's a framework, so we're able to adjust it to, as Ask a National model is revised, it still fits within this evaluation and standards. And like Colorado, we have the same type of licensed personnel evaluation for all of our licensed personnel, and it is aimed at professional growth and improvement. So even prior to these revisions, there had been a separate evaluation rubric for school counselors. The thing was, it hadn't been revised since the 80s. So it was way outdated. Some of the language was a bit confusing. It definitely wasn't aligned with national best practices, especially as the Ask a National model rolled out. So we wanted to get it revised, and we did this by having an advisory team. So if you look on the right side of the table, every time we did any of this, we convened an advisory team. And that was key because we needed the right people at the table, and that also helped get buy-in. So in addition to like having the State Department folks at the table for the conversation, we had district and school administrators, we had practicing school counselors, we had those higher ed reps from like counselor ed programs and such. Even had someone from our state school boards association and people from human resources. So although the bulk of these advisory teams have been school counselors or counselor educators, we've had other folks at the table too, like the school administrators who would need to evaluate them or needed to tell us what they needed for a school counselor to address, and then we could match it to the appropriate practices. So each time we had an advisory team. So again, this in turn helped support the buy-in from others, and all of this is now in state board policy. So that helped us with getting that accomplished. The collaboration between the state agency for public education and the state association for school counseling has been imperative, and I can't stress enough how important it is for any state wanting to truly accomplish accomplish something in supporting school counseling, if you're trying to update your evaluation or something like that, it is imperative for the state association for school counseling and your state contact at your state Department of Public Ed to collaborate. For example, in North Carolina, I'm the state consultant for school counseling. You can now say you've heard from the entire state staff for school counseling in North Carolina. And I serve as a liaison, a non-voting position on our state association's board. And in turn, whenever I need school counselor representation on like advisory committees or task force or anything like we have a current school mental health initiative going on, I reach out to our North Carolina School Counselor Association. And we keep one another informed on trends, what the needs are. We work together to address those needs in support of school counseling and the profession and the students. So the other part of that too is that I have a voice as the state consultant. I have a voice and involvement within the state agency, whereas our North Carolina School Counselor Association is the boots on the ground school counselors, and they also employ a lobbyist. And I'm not sure if folks that work outside of state education agencies realize this, but most of us that are employed at our state education agencies are not allowed to talk with a lobbyist. I mean, not a lobbyist, legislators, whereas a lobbyist can. So I can't like pick up the phone and call up a legislator and say, you know what school counselors need? Most state employees are not allowed to do that. So, but the School Counselor Association has a lobbyist who can. And that helped get a lot of this done. So when we rolled out the new job description in 2006, the School Counselor Association president, they had a director at the time, and myself, we met and co-created presentation slides to be used in trainings that would be done across the state or wherever on our state standards and their alignment with the Ask a National model. We actually used the then Ask a National model training slides from the American School Counselor Association to develop our state presentation slides. And again, all at the same table, because whenever we wanted that training presented, we wanted to make sure it was one vision, one voice, we were all saying the same thing. That was easy most of the time because usually we were co-presenting, but even if we weren't, if I went off and did a presentation without the state association or they did a presentation without me, we were using the same slides. And by the way, no, I have not been at the state association for 15 consecutive years. I was here in 06 and came back about 5 years ago. So it was a return. It wasn't 15 consecutive years. And I'm going to come back to the one at the bottom, the General Statute 115C 316.1. Duties of School Counselors Law. I'm going to come back to that one in just a moment and delve a little bit deeper into how we did the standards and evaluation first. So we started out rolling this out, conducting regional trainings across the state. Again, almost all of these, I was one of the presenters and someone from the School Counselor Association was the other presenter. And we did that for the first several years. As more school counseling graduates were getting Ask a National model in their college programs and practicing school counselors had attended either a regional training or a district training or sessions at our state conference, we switched to an online self-paced module option. And participants actually received certificates of participation for their continuing education units. In that, we not only have a school counselor one, we have an administrator one, the Administrator Guide to Effective School Counseling and Evaluation. It's estimated to take approximately 5 hours for them to complete that, but it is self-paced. They can do 10 minutes today, 30 minutes tomorrow. And it is framed as this is something to help them evaluate school counselors. But in the process of learning how to use our state evaluation rubric, they're also learning more about what those professional standards mean and what our Ask a National model means in alignment with our professional standards, because those two are aligned again. The School Counselor Standards and Evaluation, the other rubric, module that's in our online system is much more in depth for school counselors. It's estimated to take them about 30 hours to complete that one, because what it does is it kind of holds their hand in implementing a comprehensive school counseling program. The activities that are within that online module, as they implement them, they're actually implementing their comprehensive school counseling program in their school. So it's pretty in depth. I always tell them up front, don't think you're going to get this done quickly. Just work on it throughout the semester or the school year. But it helps them a lot in really digging deep into the ASCA national model and our state standards. One of our challenges with this is these are completely voluntary. No one's required to take them. You do have to be in a North Carolina public school to be able to do it, because they are in our state home-based digital platform that's available to all of our public schools, both traditional and charter, but you have to be a state school employee to be able to access those. So going back to the general statute, because this is pretty key, and this was mentioned on the first slide, but I told you I'd get back to it, so now. So this came after years of advocacy from our State Department, our state association, including their lobbyists, and school counselors from across the state. Our state association does host an annual legislative day in which our school counselors from across the state come to the state capitol and meet with their representatives to discuss their identified needs in school counseling. The year following the adoption of the then new school counselor job description, the state legislators directed our State Department of Public Instruction to research and report back on how well that new job description was being followed. Because they were hearing from school counselors, yeah, we have the job description, but we're not allowed to do it. We're made to do this, that, and the other. So they actually did a research study and found out what the key concerns were. Of course, any of you in other states where this is an issue, you know, testing coordination can be a big one. So after the Sandy Hook tragedy in December of 2012, the legislature brought their attention back to this. And, excuse me, they passed a School Safety Act, and within that School Safety Act was this Duties of School Counselors law. It aligned with our state standards and the ASCA national model. It required counselors spend 80% of their time in direct services. And the thing that just thrilled us all is it made it against the law in the state of North Carolina for a public school counselor to serve as the testing coordinator. They cannot be, it basically says school counselors cannot be the coordinators of standardized testing. That is what the statute says. What it aligns as direct services, again, are aligned with our state standards and the ASCA national model. So that has been incredibly supportive. Again, this is another thing that's applicable to our traditional public schools. So charter schools, private schools, and the like do not have to abide by this statute. So looking at all this, you would think we just live in school counselor utopia in North Carolina. But I'm going to get back to some barriers in just a moment that make all of these things still challenging, but we are pleased to have all these standards in place. Since we are with the College and Career Readiness and Success Center, one of the other things I wanted to be sure to cover was something that we're doing specifically around career and college readiness. So in 2014, myself and a couple of representatives from the School Counselor Association and someone from our College Foundation of North Carolina participated in the White House convening on strengthening school counseling and college access. We came to the same conclusions we do on so many things. We need more preparation, such as more pervasive preparation for school counselors to be effective in college and career advising, and that school administrators needed stronger knowledge of how to most effectively utilize their school counselors to promote that student success. And both of these folks needed to be better equipped to create school cultures that support high expectations in career and college readiness for every student. So we created a multidisciplinary school counseling strategic leadership team focused on school counselor, administrator, and we added career development coordinator skills in supporting student career and college readiness. Earlier, someone asked about involvement of counselor educators. This team, very hand-picked folks on this team, and we have 4 counselor educators. We have, I think, 3 administrator education programs represented. We have someone from the community college. We have people from college access programs. We have folks from the business community, the School Counselor Association, and our State Department of Public Instruction. So it's a 25-member team. The initial invitation to be on this team came from our then state superintendent, which of course helped us get some strong involvement. And this group has been working diligently to foster the career and college readiness skills that we need within our state. They developed goals, objectives, and strategies looking at pre-service and in-service for school counselors, administrators, and career development coordinators. In their research, we created a Preparing Educators to Support Career and College Readiness Recommendations report that was presented to the State Board of Education. This influenced some State Board of Ed policy revisions related to administrative preparation programs and school counselor provisional licensing. One of the things that we were just thrilled, although it's not quite as strong as what we wanted, is it is now required in our higher ed administrative preparation programs that they have to include in the curricula roles of instructional support personnel such as school counselors. We're going to continue to try to strengthen that, and but that wasn't required before, and that's been one of the difficulties, because even your most well-intentioned great school administrators, if they haven't been trained in what school counselors do, it makes it really difficult for them to effectively utilize their school counselors. So we're trying to address that concern. One of the big things that's also come out of this team is securing support for the Southern Regional Education Board's Go Alliance Academy course implementation. These are online courses that are just amazing at the skills that they help enhance, and school counselor skills and career development coordinator skills in their supporting career and college readiness. So we've just really gotten a lot of great feedback on those. So again, sounds great, but there are always challenges underlying anything that's going great. Most of our school administrative preparation programs still do not include that instruction on effective roles yet. That's a fairly new policy. And although our State Department does have these, all of our education programs have to be approved for us to license their graduates, it is a kind of a cyclical thing. So until they come up for review again, they don't have to do this yet. So right now, it's getting the word out and helping them figure out how will they do that. There's insufficient funding for the numbers of school counselors needed, and support for school counselors. School counselors are not required in North Carolina schools, although we have all these standards and legislation of if you've got a counselor, this is how you have to use them. They're not actually legally required. And there's also local control, which local control in a lot of ways can be a great thing. But when you combine everything you see on this slide of administrators trying to figure out what the most effective roles of school counselors are without the training, not having enough money to have enough school counselors, and then they're not required, and then local control means the ultimate authority of how things will be implemented rests with the local boards of education and district superintendents. That can make it really difficult to implement everything we've just talked about on these other slides. So although we've come a very long way in North Carolina in supporting effective school counseling, and we'll continue to work on that, we still have some of the same challenges that others have. So some key takeaways that I hope you'll get from this is that collaboration between your State Department of Ed and your state association and key stakeholders is vital. That collaboration is so many times they won't listen to one of us. You've probably been in situations where you said something, somebody else walked in from another association, said the exact same thing, and all of a sudden it's vital. So collaboration is key. It's also key to educate others on what comprehensive school counseling is and the positive difference it makes. So that data showing what the difference is with comprehensive school counseling. Be proactive in addressing the question, what's in it for me? So be able to let administrators or legislators or whoever it is you're talking to, how does it help them to have comprehensive school counseling being effectively implemented in your schools and having enough school counselors? What's in it for them? If their big thing is dropout prevention, tell them how it helps dropout prevention. If it's school safety, tell them how it helps school safety. So jump on those related bandwagons that are being supported, like frequently it is school safety. And be patient. This takes a lot of time. It is worth it, but you really have to be patient because it takes much longer than most of us want it to. So again, I mentioned that I would share some websites with you so you can look up some of the things I talked about. So there's the website for the state board policy that I mentioned. When you get to that website, if you look under the eval standards, you can find the school counseling standards. And on the DPI school counseling Google site, which I've got the bit.ly there for you, you can find a whole section on professional standards and the related legislation. So thank you all so much. I hope I didn't talk too quickly, but I was trying to get through a lot of information.
That's wonderful, Cynthia. Thank you so much. So we've had a number of questions coming in based on your presentations. I want to thank both Colorado and North Carolina for helping us and participating in this event today. I do have a question. One of the things I noticed is that North Carolina was very intentional about including administrators in part of the training, and it made me wonder, in Colorado, who uses your evaluation rubric? I sort of assume that that varies by district, but are there training modules that help kind of anchor users?
So I'm happy to answer that question. So unfortunately, we don't have something as robust as North Carolina described in what they're supporting with their evaluators. But districts do have the flexibility to determine who does the evaluation for SSPs or school counselors in this case. So we've talked about, and something that our legislation does allow for, is an evaluator designee. So it might be somebody that doesn't hold a principal license, but can still conduct the evaluation to the fullest extent. And so we talk a lot to districts about how might that be helpful, especially in the case of a school counselor being evaluated, let's say by a former social studies teacher. How can we think about ways to provide that content-specific feedback to our school counselors? We do have sort of a companion guide to our school counselor rubric that is posted and available on our website. We call it our Practical Ideas Guide. And it's sort of like this companion to the rubric itself, and it provides some ways in which to think about how might this play out in a rural district versus what does this look like with a school-based school counselor. And so we do have that available as a resource and a tool, but ultimately districts get to decide, what training do they require of their evaluators and what tools do they implement as well. And I don't know if Eve has anything to add to that as well.
The one thing I would like to add is that when we did the work groups and actually came together, that the administrators on that work team were great to say something like, well, how would I evaluate that if I don't? So we were very intentional in making the rubric something that the administrator could use. And hopefully it is a conversation between the school counselor and the evaluator, and they really do sit down and talk about each of the standards and quality indicators that are on that rubric.
So one of the other things I notice about the work that you all have done is the importance of involving a wide range of stakeholders in developing all of these resources that you have developed. And Eve, you just mentioned, how important it is to acknowledge the differences in the resources that a rural district would have versus a large, say, urban district. How do these evaluation practices kind of account for the wide variety of contexts into which they're being used?
Courtney, would you like to take that?
Ooh, that's a good one. It really sort of goes back to what Eve had mentioned about this being a conversation, and that if this is really a tool and a system for professional growth, that's really where it starts. And so, I think ultimately us at the state, we can only provide what we can in terms of applicability. And so that's why we really tried to think about that practical idea guide, allowing for evaluators and school counselors to have at least a resource to go to say, oh, yeah, this could look like this here with me out in Burlington, Colorado, versus, oh, this looks very different here in Denver Public Schools. And so to Eve's point, as a working group, really revise those professional practices, trying to be intentional about writing language that was specific enough to get to quality implementation, but also generalizable enough that it would be a good starting point for a conversation for a rural educator or our suburban urban folks as well.
And that's similar to what it is in North Carolina too, in that it really is going to take a conversation. And we view that also as the opportunity for the school counselor to, educate an administrator who's trying to learn more about school counseling. To help support that, we made a couple of documents that the administrators can use. It's literally questions for them to ask, because sometimes they're not even sure what questions to ask. They get awesome training in school administration, but it's anywhere from a 48 to 60-hour master's degree program to be a school counselor. We can't expect our administrators to know all that without somebody helping educate them on it. And so that discussion that Courtney mentioned and Eve mentioned, that is so key in doing that. And so giving them tools like the items on the evaluation rubric or a Q&A doc that they can ask questions of their school counselor, like, how did you do this? And how a school counselor addresses, say, low performing or attendance issues, regardless of whether it's an urban district or urban school or rural school. Each school counselor can personalize that to the data within their individual school and be able to have that conversation with the school administrator.
Great.
I feel like here in Colorado that the new evaluation tool really empowers school counselors to have that conversation, and that's something that we and the department really want to empower, because we are service. And so when I am in the field and I'm talking with school counselors and meeting with their principals, just empowering that conversation.
Exactly.
Great. Well, I have a couple other questions I want to ask, but I think what I'd like to do is make sure we have time to hear from Loretta, and then maybe circle back to some of the other questions. So thank you, folks, and we'll hear from Loretta now. Loretta, you may be muted.
There we go. Okay.
There you are.
So, thank you. Let me go back here. So, hi everyone, and boy, this was informative for me, and I admire what's happened in North Carolina, and I admire what's happened in Colorado. I have, as a policymaker and influencer, as I see my role now as executive director for California School Counselors, I look towards and need these kinds of progress that's been made for school counselors in a way that gives me leverage when speaking to those that really make those decisions. So what informs me most, I think, is my role as a school administrator for over 20 years in a district that led many programs, and including school counselors. But one of the experiences I had was when I was over health clinics for the entire city. That was a relationship between some funds that our city had and our school district had in order to bring health services. And I remember that I was always going outside and picking up trash. And you think, well, what does this have to do with evaluation? But what I realized as the administrator of that program is that the staff and other people, they own their job and what they were doing, but they didn't own the whole concept of what the health clinic was trying to provide. And that's often how I look at the college and career readiness piece, is who owns that in a particular state or a particular district when they look at the work that needs to be done in order to affect change in students' lives. And my experience has taught me that a lot of times the school counselors don't own that piece. And it's like a ball being tossed from one direction to another, depending on the district and depending on the series of expertise. even though there's robust training and pre-service training standards for that, it still doesn't seem to trickle into an ownership piece. And so in the state of California, we look at it from the perspective of, what I've been trying to do is to move that piece forward a bit so that the state understands that we own it. So partnering and looking at pieces. But the other way of owning it is through an evaluation system that includes the college and career readiness as a robust piece in the evaluation process. And I think it's just essential. And I love to see what's being done. In fact, we were looking at some pieces in California. I was looking into what North Carolina had done and what Colorado had done. And so we were doing our own research in order to prepare for the legislative season that begins somewhere around November this year, what we could do to really affect change. So briefs like this, my reaction to it is that they're essential. So I come in empty-handed if I'm trying to convince legislators on any aspect of change that affects students, but also works within the school counseling profession. And briefs that help point the direction for me and others in making decisions are great. What I have to look at in regards to legislative and policy changes is determining the need. And like Molly said in the beginning, is right now the ebb and flow of legislation is really focused on all the articles. If it bleeds, it leads, or if it's above the fold, as the saying goes, then that's where a lot of times legislation is. So right now there's articles coming out almost daily on the anxiety of students, mental health issues, school safety, and so when and some of you alluded to this, is that so when you're looking at where you find inroads, there's an inroad there right now in legislation and probably even funding in our state, which is also a local controlled state, but also how does my organization, our association, oversee and see if we can use this as leverage to also get the college and career piece, because it has been not really to the level that we'd like it to be. So the questions that we look at is how much does it cost, and how do we word the language? And so even the language of 250 to 1, the way we leverage that rhetoric and use that, as we say 250 to 1 is the minimum standard. It's not the ideal, it's minimum, so that we train people that are out there like legislators to understand that how woefully inadequate we are. Right now our ratios are 622 to 1. And as some of you know, it used to be 1,000 to 1 in California. So we're making progress, but we're not there yet. So how do we frame our position? How do we get people, the educational leaders on our on board? How do we get others on board? So, and how do we recommend practices and state oversight and reporting requirements? And so I truly believe that without oversight and without reporting requirements, you only get what the old adage is which is random acts of guidance. And so what I also look at is how can we influence those kinds of things, and having evaluation tools, having training for administrators, those kinds of things are very helpful. But also, in my belief of symbolic leadership, is creating that image. Creating the image that school counselors are the go-to person. School counselors are the only ones on our campuses that have a formal official training in college and career readiness. The only providers. So that is often my message when I'm advocating for school counselors in regards to the college and career readiness piece. So one of the things that we do is like using the data from the brief is very, very helpful. It helps, even though I can't come in heavy with research when I talk to legislators, having that as a backup, giving it to their staff members, utilizing things like that, or having a link is very important and essential. one of the things that we are doing is that we in California just created a best practice document. And so that's an 8-page document that is for superintendents and legislators that talks about the best practices out there. So it takes all of these factors, and for an example, we were looking at within that, who are our best practices districts in different areas. And we find that, not every district is a best practice district in every area in regards to school counselors. But can we take the pieces that they're excellent with and see what they had done and promote that in a brief type of document to allow for our superintendents and our schools and our legislators to actually see how that can be done effectively. And so not only do we utilize research for this document and sort of the overview and all the state documentations that relate, including ed code in it, but we also populate with schools that are effective and school districts that are effective. So the other thing that I thought about in regards to this wonderful webinar was just the trifecta piece, and that was talked about by Cynthia talked about it in regards to North Carolina, and really what she was referring to is what I call the trifecta, is when you have a strong state association along with a strong counselor education association, along with a strong Department of Education. That is really a trifecta for a state, because working together collaboratively can really make institutional changes. And I can't overstress that enough. And when we look at it as an association, we look to build both our counselor education, collaborative and group, along with our State Department in order to affect change. So with that, I think it was just wonderful research. I look forward to seeing where this is going to go in the future. And I appreciate really Molly and Helen and all the work that you both have done on regards to this project.
Thanks, Loretta. So one of the things that we've heard from both North Carolina, Colorado, and now you, is the importance of partnering with folks from the field, and particularly something that Cynthia pointed out, how they partnered with the State School Counseling Association to promote policies that advance practices. So do you have any recommendations for state and district level administrators for partnering?
For state and district administrators, build relationships on a number of issues, find common alliances, be there for them, be there as a resource. If you're not, instead of asking for assistance or to be noticed, I flipped that script a while ago in my advocacy efforts to just be there. So I had an appointment next week with the Senate Pro Tem's office, person over K-12 education and in the state, and I have been a resource for her over the course of years as she's moved through different positions, and it's so helpful when I pitch what I want. So I have been silent sometimes for years, silent helping a legislator or helping others to move forward with putting my agenda kind of on the sidebar agenda, not a straight on request, but giving them and continuing to build their image of what I believe is an effective school structure, with school counselors being an integral part of the educational system. But it's taken a long time. And then getting people behind us, like the School Boards Association, the Teachers Union, the small school districts in the state group. There's a lot of groups out there that are really looking for ways to put together a common approach to solving some of the problems that we all share in common.
Thank you. So one of the things that we know is that averages hide variation. So if we think about the state school counselor ratios, there's likely a fair bit of variation in there, but one of our participants wanted to know, with a ratio even of 250 to 1, how can school counselors support comprehensive post-secondary planning? And I'll open that up to any of our presenters.
Hi, this is Cynthia in North Carolina. It is challenging. That is without a question, especially if you're the only counselor with the 250 or 300 students. I think it helps to look at a tiered process similar to MTSS, which to me, the ironic thing about MTSS, which is growing hugely now, is that's how we've always done school counseling, was in a tiered process. And that you've got some things that you do for all students, and then you've got some things that you do for a targeted group of students, and some things that get a little bit more intensive attention. So, for example, a school counselor in a middle school, at the beginning of the year, they're helping 6th graders make that transition in the middle school. At the end of the year, they're helping 8th graders get ready for high school. And we do the same thing with that transition with career and college readiness. For those 9th graders, they need the basics. They might not need you individually yet as much as, say, the juniors and seniors do. So trying to follow that tiered approach, and that the services that you're providing match the level of need that the students have. You know, what can you do with a whole room full of students versus what needs to be done in small groups or individually?
This is Molly, just jumping. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Molly. I'll follow you.
I was just going to say really quickly, although now in San Francisco, I was a practicing school counselor in Colorado, and I found the ICAP process to be a very effective way of influencing post-secondary and workforce readiness. So.
And that's exactly what I was going to speak to, is with the ICAP process, and it is a process, it's not exactly a product. And so involve everybody. It just doesn't fall to the school counselor. Let's teach everybody to have those career conversations and encourage students and empower them to look beyond the next steps of high school and where they're going to be successful and most happy. And that really is what the ICAP process is. It doesn't fall just to the school counselor.
That's great. Thank you. So do the school counselors do they train teachers in having some of those conversations and doing some of the planning?
They certainly can. Every district is a little different, the way that their ICAP process works. As I mentioned during my slides, that we have ICAP facilitators within the state of Colorado that are regionally, and they will go out and train. We work everywhere we can to talk about the ICAP process and career conversations. And then we're also working on an ICAP playbook that isn't out yet, but there's an ICAP playbook work group, and be happy to share that once it's ready to share beyond the work group.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we're almost at time. I wanted to thank all of our panelists today. I think we've had a really wonderful conversation. I hope folks will take a few minutes at the end of the webinar today to complete the survey. I want to remind you that the brief that we were speaking of today is on the College and Career Readiness and Success Center website. And in that brief, you'll find a table that includes a rich list of resources from not only the states we heard from today and the states that are profiled more deeply in the brief, but from all of the materials we were able to find. So I want to thank you again. Jenny, do you have any closing remarks? If you do, you might be on mute. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone very much for your time today. I hope you found our conversation helpful, and I very much look forward to, if you have any questions, you know where to find us at the center. We're happy to answer any questions that we didn't get to today if you'd like to follow up. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.